Knights and their shining armour are often tied to heroism in our imagination, but the truth is many medieval knights were more terrifying than inspiring. They weren't just protectors or romanticised figures galloping off to rescue damsels. They were, in practice, the muscle of the feudal system. Imagine heavily armed enforcers stomping through muddy villages, their coats of mail glinting in the sun, not to defend the people living there, but to remind them who was in charge. These knights were often more interested in protecting their lord's wealth and land than looking out for anyone who actually needed help. In 11th century France, lords frequently deployed knights to burn entire villages or lay waste to rival estates. Violence was the main currency of power. Knights weren't just elite fighters, they were also tools of oppression. If a rival lord started causing trouble, knights might be sent in to torch his crops, loot his granaries, and make sure everyone knew who held the real authority. The people who suffered most weren't the nobles playing these games. They were the ordinary families caught in the middle. Late 11th century chroniclers write of Norman knights sacking villages to enforce feudal claims, leaving behind nothing but burned fields and hungry survivors. For most villagers, the sight of armoured riders coming over the hill was a warning, not a promise of protection. This violence wasn't reserved for times of open war. Even during stretches of uneasy peace, knights enforced harsh taxes and the will of their lords. If peasants couldn't pay, knights would show up to seize livestock, food or tools, sometimes leaving entire families with nothing to get them through the winter. Sometimes the punishment was even more severe. A few stubborn villages could be destroyed outright to set an example. For people living under medieval rule, the knight's arrival usually meant trouble, and it didn't end there. By the 14th century, when wars slowed down and knights found themselves out of work, many formed mercenary bands called free companies. These weren't just a few rowdy soldiers. These were organised groups of unemployed knights and men-at-arms who roamed Europe, exacting tribute from anyone who crossed their path. If a village couldn't pay, the free companies would sack it. They'd take food, valuables, and sometimes even kidnap people for ransom. The robber knights of the German lands were notorious for turning to outright banditry, stopping merchants on the road and demanding payment for safe passage, then taking the goods anyway. In some regions, a knight's coat of arms was less a shield of protection and more a warning label. The brutality of knightly violence wasn't limited to property and goods. Few medieval texts warned against raping common women, so sexual violence went largely unchecked during raids and wars. Women, especially those outside the noble class, were often treated as spoils of war, with little recourse or protection. For peasants, there was no chivalric code to shield them. The rules of honour knights swore to mostly apply to fellow nobles, not to the people working the land or living in the villages. Justice for these acts was rare. Knights operated in a culture that glorified combat and pillage, and much of the violence they committed was considered just part of the job. When knights raided enemy territories, looting was expected. It was how they supplemented their income and rewarded their followers. Castles and villages were treasure troves, and even people became commodities. Noble captives could be ransomed for huge sums, turning war into a business opportunity. Commoners captured in these raids faced enslavement or forced labour, with little hope of rescue. The code of chivalry, for all its high-minded ideals, was often just a tool to manage the violence of the knightly class. As historian Richard Cayupa points out, medieval writers sometimes glorified gruesome acts of killing, as long as they served the right cause. The line between heroism and brutality blurred quickly when the victims were peasants or rival soldiers. Jennifer Goodman Woollock, a professor of medieval studies, describes knights as hired thugs with horses and armour, and chivalry as an attempt to make them respected and respectable. The reality was that knights were expected to be violent. They just needed to direct that violence in ways that served the interests of the elite. If you were a peasant, you probably learned quickly that the chivalric code didn't include you. Knights might follow strict rules of engagement when fighting other nobles. No attacking from behind, no killing unarmed opponents, that sort of thing. But those rules rarely extended to the lower classes. The code mostly protected those already in power. For everyone else, knights could be ruthless, and their actions went unpunished as long as they benefited their lords. Even the church, which tried to rein in the worst excesses of knightly violence, had limited success. The Peace and Truce of God movements in the 10th and 11th centuries were attempts to limit violence against non-combatants and the clergy, but enforcement was spotty at best. The papacy eventually grew so frustrated with the endless feuding and village burning that Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade, hoping to redirect the knights' aggression toward a common enemy in the Middle East. Knights were offered indulgences, spiritual rewards, for fighting Muslims, a move designed to get them out of Europe and away from their own people. The violence didn't stop. It just changed direction. The weapons knights used tell you a lot about their priorities. Swords, lances, maces and warhammers weren't just for show. They were designed to inflict maximum damage, especially on armoured opponents. In battle, knights aimed for the gaps in armour, going for fatal blows instead of playing by any fair fight rules. The focus was on winning, not on honour. Medieval chroniclers sometimes described the aftermath of battles in gruesome detail, celebrating the carnage when it suited their cause. Knights also played a big role in private feuds. In medieval Germany, for example, feuding between knightly families was common. These weren't honourable duels, they were campaigns of destruction. Knights would gather their followers, besiege castles, and lay waste to entire regions just to gain an advantage over a rival. The local population suffered the most, with homes destroyed, crops burned, and families forced to flee. For many, this cycle of violence seemed never-ending, and the ideals of chivalry felt like a distant fantasy. If you're picturing a world where the people sworn to uphold honour are the same ones raiding your home, demanding taxes you can't pay, and using their swords to settle personal scores, you're not far off. The gap between the chivalric ideal and the everyday reality was enormous. Knights could be both the heroes of legend and the villains of real life. For peasants and townsfolk, the arrival of a knight wasn't a sign of rescue. It was often a reason to hide or run. All of this paints a much rougher picture of knighthood than the stories suggest. The chivalric code set high ideals, but those ideals rarely protected anyone outside the elite. Violence was built into every part of a knight's life, and the people at the bottom paid the price. The same hands that carried banners of justice could just as easily wring you dry for tax money, or leave your village in ruins. But violence wasn't the only way knights betrayed their own ideals. Sometimes it wasn't about swords or armour at all. There were other ways to become a knight, ways that had little to do with courage or honour, and a lot more to do with something much simpler. Money had a way of opening doors in the medieval world, and knighthood was no exception. The shining promise of honour and valour could sometimes be set aside if you had enough coins to spare. Take, for example, the way King Edward III of England sold knighthoods to fund his campaigns in the 100 Years' War. All you needed was the right sum, and suddenly you were elevated to the ranks of the warrior elite. No battlefield heroics or years of loyal service required. This practice widened the gulf between the chivalric ideal and the knight's real motives, as wealth, not valour, often won the spurs. Originally, earning a knighthood wasn't supposed to be easy. You'd start as a page, running errands and learning the ropes, then move up to squire, cleaning armour and training for battle. Only after years of service and proving yourself in the field might you be knighted in a formal ceremony. That's the fairy tale version. The reality, especially as time went on, was a lot more flexible. If you were wealthy enough, you could simply pay your way in, skipping all the hard work and danger. The knightly title became a status symbol, something you could buy if you had the right connections and a full purse. This wasn't just a trickle down from the top either. Lords and monarchs strapped for funds saw the sale of knighthoods as a practical solution. The fees could be steep, but for those outside the old noble families, it was a shortcut to prestige and social mobility. Suddenly, you didn't need to be born into the right family or prove yourself in battle. You just had to have enough money. The respect that came with Sir in front of your name could be yours for a price, and nobody needed to know if you'd ever swung a sword in earnest. It wasn't only knighthoods that could be bought. Pope Urban II's 1995 call to arms for the First Crusade promised a plenary indulgence, a full pardon for sins, to anyone who joined the campaign. Titles, pardons, and spiritual rewards were all up for grabs if you could answer the call or pay the right fee. The idea of chivalry as a selfless code began to look more and more like a transaction, and the people who benefited most weren't always the bravest or most honourable. This shift didn't just change who could be a knight, it changed what knighthood meant. When money became the main requirement, the connection to honour, loyalty, or martial skill faded. Some of the new knights did try to live up to the ideals, but plenty saw their title as a ticket to privilege. The badge of knighthood became less about a pledge to protect the weak, and more about gaining access to power and influence. For the people living under these knights, the difference was clear. It didn't matter if your local protector was a seasoned warrior or someone who bought his way in. Either way, you were still expected to pay taxes, provide labour, and show respect. Knighthood was expensive to maintain, even for those who earned it the traditional way. Horses, armour, weapons, and a small household or retinue all cost money. The pressure to keep up appearances pushed many knights into a cycle of seeking more wealth. War became a business opportunity. Capturing prisoners on the battlefield wasn't just about victory, it was about ransom. Wealthy captives could be traded back to their families for huge sums. If you were unlucky enough not to have those connections, your fate was a lot less certain. This focus on profit extended to looting, which was an expected part of military campaigns. Knights didn't just fight, they plundered enemy lands for supplies and valuables. Villages, towns, and monasteries were fair game, and sometimes even churches were stripped of their treasures, despite all the religious symbolism attached to knighthood. The ideals of chivalry didn't always stand up to the lure of easy money, especially when the next campaign or tournament was looming, and you needed to pay for new armour or horses. The free companies, those bands of knights and men-at-arms who found themselves out of work between wars, took this mercenary spirit to the next level. In 14th century Italy, for example, these groups roamed the countryside, offering their swords to the highest bidder, or simply raiding villages for tribute. Loyalty to a lord or a cause was often temporary. If a better offer came along, knights were quick to switch sides or turn to outright banditry. War and violence became just another way to make a living, and chivalric ideals faded into the background. For the people on the ground, peasants, merchants, and townsfolk, the reality of knighthood was often harsh. Knights collected taxes, demanded labour, and sometimes took what they wanted by force. The The resources they squeezed from the local population funded their lifestyles, their tournaments, and their political ambitions. The very people knights were supposed to protect ended up bearing the cost of their status and power, and as more people bought their way into knighthood, the line between legitimate protector and self-serving opportunist got even blurrier. Wealthy individuals who purchased their titles didn't always take on the responsibilities that came with the name. Some never saw a battlefield or trained a squire. They simply enjoyed the privileges, land, authority, and the right to collect dues from those beneath them. Whether you were dealing with a hardened veteran or a newcomer with deep pockets, the result was often the same for ordinary people. More demands, more exploitation, and little recourse if things went wrong. This all raises a question about what honour really meant in the world of knights. If money could buy you a title, did the chivalric code have any real weight? In practice, power protected itself. Knights who broke the rules or abused their position rarely faced consequences, as long as they had the right connections or enough wealth to smooth things over. The rise of noble families through clever deals, strategic marriages, or even betrayal was just another piece of the puzzle. Knighthood became less about living up to a code and more about playing the game to your advantage. The stories of King Arthur or the Song of Roland make it easy to imagine knights as unwavering defenders of justice, but the reality was far more complicated. The code of chivalry might have sounded noble, but in many cases it was a mask for personal ambition and economic gain. The more knighthood became something you could buy, the more its ideals faded into the background. Honour, in the end, often had a price tag. Even knights who genuinely wanted to live up to the ideals of chivalry found themselves limited by the economic pressures and inequalities of their world. The system encouraged self-interest, and the gap between the image and reality of knighthood grew wider with every transaction. Of course, this is only one part of the story. The code of chivalry itself, so often celebrated in legend and song, had its own set of loopholes and blind spots. What looked like a set of noble rules on the surface sometimes turned out to be much more selective in practice. Let's talk about what the chivalric code actually meant for people living in the Middle Ages. You might picture a knight kneeling before a lady, swearing to protect the innocent, or boldly riding into battle for justice. But the real code, the one written and lived by actual knights, wasn't so much a shining beacon of morality as it was a set of rules for keeping order among the upper classes. If you weren't part of the elite, the code didn't really have your back. The chivalric code was never about fairness for everyone. It was a system meant to keep knights in check and to make sure they didn't turn their swords on the people who mattered most, their fellow nobles and lords. These were men trained for violence, carrying weapons, and sometimes itching for a fight. The code gave them a way to channel all that aggression, but only in certain directions. If you were a peasant or a merchant, you weren't included in this circle of courtesy or protection. Among knights themselves, honour was a big deal. There were rules about how to behave if you met another knight in battle. No stabbing someone in the back, no killing a noble who'd already surrendered. It was like an exclusive club where everyone knew the secret handshake, except in this case, the handshake was a mutual understanding not to go too far with each other. But those rules stopped at the edge of the noble class. If you were a foot soldier, an archer, or just someone caught in the wrong place, you could be killed or captured with no second thought. And that wasn't just a side effect, it was built into the system. Medieval warfare almost always meant raiding villages, destroying crops, and making life miserable for ordinary people. Knights were trained to do this, and it was seen as a normal part of their job. During the 100 Years' War, for example, knights ravaged farmland to starve entire regions, and this was considered a legitimate military strategy. The suffering of peasants wasn't condemned. It was just part of how war worked. The stories and poems about chivalry from the time make it pretty clear where the lines were drawn. There's a lot of talk about defending noble women, showing mercy to other knights, and upholding your word with powerful families. What you don't see are stories about knights protecting shepherds or standing up for common women. In fact, the violence that knights inflicted on lower-class people, burning villages, looting, or even worse, was barely mentioned, let alone criticised. If anything, those acts were brushed off as the cost of doing business. For women, the code was even more selective. If you were a noblewoman, you might expect a knight to defend your honour or offer you protection, but if you were a peasant woman, the rules didn't apply. Knights were known to treat women of the lower classes as spoils of war. There were few consequences for this kind of behaviour, because the code was never meant to protect everyone equally. It was about keeping up appearances among the people who counted. You'd think that with all the talk of courage and justice, knights would be held to a higher standard across the board. But in reality, the code of chivalry mostly protected those with power and status. After a battle, captured knights were often treated well, held for ransom instead of being killed. Common soldiers, on the other hand, were usually executed or forced into labour. It was a double standard that was obvious to anyone paying attention. If you weren't part of the elite, you were expendable. The reason for all this selective morality goes back to the purpose of the chivalric code itself. It wasn't designed to turn knights into saints. It was a practical tool for managing a group of men who could easily become a problem for the people in charge. Knights were dangerous, and the code was a way to keep their violence aimed in the right direction. It created boundaries for how they treated each other, but left everyone else outside those boundaries. The church played a big role in shaping the image of chivalry. Clerics and writers like to talk about knights as defenders of the faith and paragons of virtue. But this was more about public relations than reality. The church wanted to control the knights and make them seem less threatening to society. By emphasizing the softer qualities of chivalry, like courtesy and piety, they hoped to put a leash on a group that could easily get out of hand. But the reality on the ground was very different. Peasants knew knights as taxing enforcers far more often than saviours. During wartime, the church sometimes even sanctioned violence, as long as it served a higher purpose. If a lord needed to keep his lands under control, knights were sent in to collect taxes, enforce rules, and, if necessary, use force. Without written contracts or equal status, villagers could rarely appeal against knightly abuse. There was almost no legal recourse for a peasant who suffered at the hands of a knight. This cycle of violence and control showed up all over Europe, especially during long conflicts. In the 100 Years' War, knights would burn fields, destroy homes, and drive entire communities into starvation, all as part of their military strategy. The code didn't stop them, because the people suffering weren't part of the club. The laws and customs of the time offered little protection for the lower classes. If a knight destroyed your village, there wasn't much you could do. Even when knights weren't at war, the chivalric code didn't mean much for ordinary people. Knights collected taxes, demanded labour, and enforced the will of their lords. If you couldn't pay, they might take your livestock or your tools. Sometimes, whole villages were punished for the actions of a few. The code that was supposed to represent honour and justice turned out to be just another way to keep the powerful on top. And when it came to accountability, knights were rarely held responsible for their actions against commoners. Local lords depended on them to keep order and collect revenue, so there was little incentive to punish them for overstepping. The system was set up to protect the interests of the elite, not the people at the bottom. Even church efforts to rein in knightly violence, like the Peace and Truce of God movements, were only partly effective, and often ignored when it suited the needs of the powerful. If you were living in a medieval village, the chivalric code was more likely to bring you hardship than protection. Stories of knights rescuing the helpless might have sounded nice, but the day-to-day reality was much harsher. The code was a set of rules for an exclusive group, and everyone else was left to fend for themselves. The idea that knights were champions of justice was more myth than fact. So, when you think about the chivalric code, it's important to see it for what it was: a tool for social control, designed to regulate the behaviour of the elite and keep the existing hierarchy in place. It wasn't about universal morality or protecting the weak. It was about making sure the people with power could keep it, with as little trouble as possible. But if the code itself was so selective, what about the people who followed it? Did knights really fight for honour and loyalty, or did something else motivate them? Maybe the answer lies in how often knights put their own interests first, even when that meant switching sides or fighting for whoever could pay the most. Picture yourself as a medieval knight, not in the middle of a glorious battle, but standing in your drafty manor, running numbers in your head. Your armour looks impressive, but it's expensive to maintain. Your horse eats more than you do, your squire expects a wage, and even the most basic sword needs repairs. The fief you've been granted might cover some costs, but it's hardly a golden ticket. So, like a lot of knights, you start weighing your options. That's how the world of knights for hire, mercenary knights, really took off. Knighthood was supposed to be about loyalty and honour, but reality had other plans. Maintaining the image of a noble warrior cost a fortune, and most knights found themselves short on cash. The feudal system was changing, and those old, rigid bonds of loyalty between knight and lord began to loosen. Knights needed more income streams, and that's when the idea of selling their skills to the highest bidder started to make sense. Sometimes the highest bidder wasn't even their own lord. It could be a rival, a foreign king, or anyone with deep enough pockets. This new breed of knight didn't see mercenary work as a disgrace. In fact, it was practical. Warfare became a marketplace. If you had a sword, a good horse, and a reputation, you could make a living on your own terms. The 100 Years' War is a perfect example. It was long, chaotic, and full of opportunities for knights to make money, not just by fighting, but by raiding, looting, and collecting ransoms. The lines between loyalty and opportunity blurred, and knights moved between armies if the pay or prospects looked better on the other side. During these wars, knights realized there were more ways to profit than just winning battles. Raiding became part of the job description. If you were a knight, you might ride into a village, torch a few buildings, grab whatever you could carry and move on. It wasn't personal, it was just business. The real prize, though, was ransoming prisoners. Capturing a noble on the battlefield could set you up for months, maybe even years. You'd hold them for ransom, and their family would pay a fortune to get them back. Ransoming became so common that some knights aimed for it, targeting the wealthiest enemies in battle. If you were a foot soldier or a peasant, though, you didn't get that option. Knights only ransomed people who were worth something. Everyone else was just collateral damage. The rise of mercenary knights also brought about the notorious free companies. These were groups of knights and men-at-arms who banded together, sometimes during truces or after wars ended when there was no steady work. Without a lord to answer to, they became freelance fighters, roaming the countryside. They'd offer their services to whoever could pay, and if no one did, they'd simply take what they wanted by force. Villages, towns, monasteries, nothing was off limits. The The free companies didn't care about sides or causes. They cared about getting paid, and their loyalty was always for sale. One of the most infamous of these was the Great Company in 14th century Italy. They were so feared that towns would pay them just to go away. They'd sack a city, threaten another, and demand bribes for peace. It was less about chivalry and more about organised extortion. These groups blurred the line between knight and bandit, and while they still wore the trappings of knighthood, their actions were a far cry from the ideals sung about in courtly romances. Why did so many knights turn to this kind of work? The answer was simple: survival. Being a knight without money was risky. You couldn't afford the armour, horses or followers you needed to keep your status. If you fell behind, you could lose everything. So, mercenary work wasn't always about greed. Sometimes, it was the only way to stay afloat in a world where expenses never stopped. And if you could make a little extra by switching sides or taking a lucrative ransom, most knights didn't hesitate. The commercialization of warfare changed everything. Knights became more like military contractors than loyal vassals. Kings and lords understood this, and often hired mercenary bands when their own armies weren't enough. The market for military services was competitive, and knights learned to negotiate for better pay, bigger shares of loot, or more favourable conditions. Loyalty became a business decision, not a sacred vow. The church, of course, had its own ideas about what knights should be. Since the late 10th century, church leaders like Bishop Adalbero of Leon preached against knightly violence, hoping to tame the warrior class. The Peace of God movement started around 990 at Limoges, aiming to protect the poor and the church from knightly attacks. By the 11th century, the Truce of God tried to limit fighting to certain days of the week. Church councils even prayed to be delivered from knights, as Livia Gershon notes. But these efforts often fell flat. Knights ignored the rules when it suited them, raiding villages and attacking rivals despite the church's pleas. When the church couldn't control the violence at home, it tried to redirect it. The Crusades offered a new outlet. Knights were called to fight in the Holy Land, and papal indulgences promised forgiveness for their sins. The church recast aggression as holy, offering spiritual rewards that trumped local church rules. But even on crusade, knights looked for profit, looting, capturing prisoners, and fighting for personal gain as much as for faith. Switching allegiances became normal. Knights weighed their options, sometimes changing sides in the middle of a campaign if the rewards looked better elsewhere. Loyalty was flexible, and the consequences for breaking oaths were minimal if you had the right skills or connections. For peasants and townsfolk, this meant that knights could show up under one banner one year and a different one the next, always demanding taxes or supplies, always expecting respect. The mercenary system exposed the gap between the chivalric ideal and the everyday actions of knights who fought for pay, ransomed prisoners, or raided villages weren't breaking any secret code. They were following the logic of their world. Survival, profit, and status mattered more than abstract ideals. Even the most celebrated knights balanced their oaths against the need to keep their households running and their armour shining. If you were living in a village or working the land, the arrival of knights, whether they wore your lord's colours or not, often meant trouble. Raids, forced labour, and heavy taxes were part of life. The same knights who swore to protect the weak might be the ones taking your last sack of grain or burning your fields. The ideals of chivalry rarely made it past the walls of the manor house. So, while the legends tell us about honour and bravery, the reality was more complicated. Knights were shaped by the pressures of their world, and their choices reflected the hard facts of survival, wealth, and power. For most people living under their rule, knights were less about shining armour and more about the burdens they brought. Next, let's look at what life was really like for the people on the receiving end of knightly power. In 12th century France, bishops sent urgent petitions asking for relief from the chaos caused by knightly banditry. If you were a peasant living in a small village, you'd probably understand why. Life under knights wasn't just hard, it was unpredictable and sometimes terrifying. Knights are remembered for their honour and bravery, but for most people working the land, they were the ones enforcing the rules, collecting the dues, and making sure nobody forgot who was in charge. The whole system was stacked against you from the start. Under feudalism, peasants owed labour and produce under heavy rents for the knight's fief domain. You didn't own your fields or your home. Instead, you worked the land for someone else and handed over a big chunk of your harvest plus extra labour, maybe repairing roads or helping with the knight's own crops. In return, you got protection, but that word didn't always mean what you'd hope. If the harvest was bad or a storm wiped out your crops, your obligations didn't go away. The knight still expected his share, and coming up short wasn't just disappointing, it could be dangerous. Picture a group of knights riding into your village. They're not coming to help. They've come to collect taxes, rents, or whatever else their lord claims is owed. If you can't pay, they'll take what they want. Grain, chickens, tools, maybe even your only cow. Sometimes they'd seize your home or your land outright. There was no such thing as a gentle reminder or a payment plan. The rules were clear, and the power imbalance was impossible to ignore. You were always at risk of losing everything, with no real way to fight back. And if you're thinking, well, at least that only happened during bad years, think again. Even in good times, the demands never seemed to end. Knights needed money to keep up their lifestyles. Armour, horses, weapons, and all the trappings weren't cheap. So the pressure on peasants to produce enough to satisfy their lords and still feed their own families never let up. Every festival, tournament, or new construction project on the manor meant another round of taxes or forced labour. It wasn't just about survival, it was about keeping someone else comfortable. When war broke out, and it always seemed to, things got even worse. Knights led raids that could destroy everything you'd worked for in a single afternoon. Section 3 already described how knights burned crops and sacked villages, so you already know what that looked like. The thing is, the records we have only show a fraction of the real destruction. Like Tuckman's law says, the absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. If anything, the devastation was probably much greater than what made it into the official accounts. If your village was wiped out, chances are nobody wrote it down. Women in peasant families faced even more hardship. Their lives were shaped by the same crushing expectations, but with even fewer rights. Your social standing depended on your father or husband, and forced marriages were common. If a knight or his followers decided to take advantage, there was little you could do. The law wasn't on your side, and the chivalric code didn't protect you. Abuse, exploitation, and forced labour were all part of daily life, and most women had no legal recourse. Social mobility was just a dream. You were born a peasant, and you'd likely die one. The system was built to keep everyone in their place. Even if you worked hard, paid your dues, and kept out of trouble, there was almost no chance to climb higher. The knights, meanwhile, used their education and knowledge of the law to their advantage. They could read contracts, interpret rules, and find ways to squeeze even more out of the people beneath them. Most peasants couldn't read or write, so they had no way to argue or defend themselves against unfair demands. Knights didn't just enforce the rules, they made them. They acted as local judges, decided disputes, and handed out punishments. If you had a problem or wanted to appeal a decision, your options were limited. The knight's word was final, and it usually favoured his own interests or those of his lord. Corruption was common, and there was little oversight. If a knight wanted to collect an extra tax or impose a new rule, there wasn't much you could do except obey. Even in times of so-called peace, knights could be a source of fear. Some formed bands, robber knights as we talked about earlier, who roamed the countryside demanding tolls from merchants and bullying anyone who looked vulnerable. The line between legitimate authority and outright banditry was thin, and for most people it didn't make much difference. Whether the knight was working for a lord or for himself, you were still the one paying the price. A lot of people imagine knights as noble defenders, but for peasants, they were more like enforcers for the wealthy. You worked the land, grew the food, and built the wealth that kept the whole system running, but you saw little benefit from it. When knights hosted grand tournaments or feasts, it was your labour that made it possible. Every celebration meant more taxes, more work, and less for your own family. The stories told about knights rarely mentioned the people who made their lives possible. It's easy to look back and wonder why peasants didn't resist, but the truth is, the risks were huge. The law was on the side of the knights, and any act of rebellion could be brutally punished. Sometimes, whole villages faced collective fines or worse if someone tried to push back. The church might preach about charity and kindness, but in practice, it often supported the existing order. The knight's power was reinforced by tradition, law, and force, leaving ordinary people with few options. Still, not everyone accepted this quietly. There were moments of protest, villagers refusing to pay new taxes, or communities banding together to petition their lords. Sometimes the church stepped in, especially when the violence got out of hand. Bishops and priests would plead for mercy or try to mediate disputes, but their influence was limited. The basic structure of feudal society stayed the same, with knights holding most of the power and peasants bearing most of the burden. Day-to-day life for a peasant was a long series of compromises and calculations. You'd do what you could to avoid drawing attention, pay what you owed, and hope for a good harvest. Every year brought new risks, bad weather, disease, war, or the unpredictable demands of the knights. If you managed to keep your family safe and fed, it was a victory. But the reality was that most people lived right on the edge, and a single bad season or harsh demand could push them into poverty or starvation. The suffering of peasants rarely made it into the official histories. Chroniclers wrote about knights and kings, battles and treaties, but the daily struggles of ordinary people went mostly unrecorded. The silence in the record speaks volumes. The reality was harsher than most stories suggest, and the gap between the legend of chivalry and the truth of peasant life was wide. Knights might have seen themselves as honourable and just, but for the people under their rule, those ideals felt distant. The code of chivalry was a private language among the elite, and most peasants were left out of the conversation. Their lives were shaped by forces beyond their control: war, law, custom, and the relentless demands of those with power. Of course, knights weren't the only ones shaping this world. The church played a major role in how people thought about honour, justice, and power. Its leaders tried to influence knightly behaviour, sometimes with grand ambitions and sometimes just trying to limit the damage. But whether those efforts made a difference, or just added another layer of complexity, is another story. If you look at the way the church tried to shape the lives of knights, you see a mix of ambition, hope, and a fair bit of frustration. The church wanted knights to be more than just muscle for the powerful. They wanted these armoured warriors to serve as protectors of peace and defenders of the weak. not just enforcers of a harsh system. So, the church set out to transform the knightly class, not just for their own sake, but for the good of everyone living under their rule. This push for reform really took off with the Peace of God movement in the late 10th century. Church leaders, including bishops at councils like Charroux and Limoges, called for knights to stop attacking non-combatants, especially clergy, peasants, and women. The idea was to draw a line in the sand. Violence against the defenceless was off limits. If a knight crossed that line, the church threatened them with spiritual penalties like excommunication, which in theory was a terrifying prospect. For the church, this wasn't just about keeping the peace. It was about using spiritual authority to curb the worst excesses of feudal violence. But the church didn't stop there. Soon after, the Truce of God movement emerged, adding another layer of restrictions. Now knights were told not just who they couldn't attack, but when they couldn't fight at all. Fighting was forbidden from Thursday evening to Monday morning, and during religious times like Lent and Advent. These rules were announced at church councils and reinforced by popes, including Pope Urban II, who granted indulgences and spiritual rewards to those who followed church edicts. The church hoped that by limiting the days and seasons available for fighting, they could put some brakes on the endless cycles of feudal warfare. These efforts weren't just written down in dusty books. The church held big public ceremonies where knights would swear oaths to respect the peace and truce of God. The threat of excommunication hung over these events, and the rituals were designed to impress on knights the seriousness of their promises. It was a spectacle. Priests in their vestments, banners waving, and entire communities gathered to watch knights make their vows. There was a sense of hope that maybe, just maybe, these rituals would change something. But the reality was much messier. Chroniclers of the time note that many nobles simply flaunted the truce's terms, sometimes even laying siege to castles on Sundays or during holy seasons. Enforcement was uneven, as knights prioritized feudal loyalty over ecclesiastical edicts. The church's rules were clear, but the incentives for knights to follow them were weak. The rewards for loyalty to a lord, land, money, prestige, were immediate and concrete. The threat of spiritual penalties, on the other hand, felt distant, especially in a world where the church itself relied on knights for protection and support. Take the example of a knight called to war by his lord. Even if the church had declared a truce or forbidden fighting during a religious holiday, the pressure from a powerful lord could easily outweigh the church's warnings. Knights swore oaths to the church, but their day-to-day lives were shaped by the demands of the feudal system. If a lord needed a castle taken or a rival's lands raided, few knights hesitated because of a church calendar. The system rewarded boldness and aggression, not restraint. For the people the church aimed to protect, these rules often felt like empty promises. If a knight burned a village or attacked a monastery, the church could threaten excommunication, but unless the knight cared about his spiritual standing, or risked losing land or favour, there wasn't much stopping him. The church's penalties only worked if knights valued their place in the community, or feared losing their afterlife. For many, the need for wealth and influence mattered more. The church's influence was further complicated by its own reliance on knightly power. The church owned vast lands and needed knights to defend them. If a bishop or abbot faced threats from rival lords, they turned to knights for help. So when those same knights ignored church edicts or caused trouble, the church often hesitated to crack down too hard. Condemning a powerful noble could backfire, especially if that noble commanded armies essential to the church's security. Still, the church didn't give up on trying to reform the knightly class. They kept up the pressure through sermons, councils, and public shaming. Bishops like Adalbero of Leon preached against knightly violence in the 1040s, and church councils continued to call for peace. By the late 11th century, church leaders were even praying to be delivered from the violence of knights, as chroniclers like Livia Gershon note. The message was clear. Knights were supposed to be guardians, not oppressors. But knights had their own way of interpreting church teachings. Many saw warfare as a sacred duty, especially when the church itself called for violence in the name of faith. The Crusades are the clearest example. Pope Urban II promised remission of sins for crusaders, effectively buying knightly devotion and redirecting their aggression toward enemies of Christendom. Suddenly, the violence that the church tried to limit at home became not just acceptable, but holy when aimed at outsiders. Knights could now see themselves as instruments of God's will, fighting for salvation with sword in hand. This created a strange paradox. The church wanted knights to be peaceful at home but aggressive abroad. The code of chivalry, shaped in part by church ideals, told knights to protect the weak and serve the church, but it also glorified martial prowess and honour won in battle. Knights were expected to be both gentle and fierce, pious and ruthless. The result was a set of ideals that could be interpreted in whatever way suited a knight's ambitions. Knights learned to navigate this ambiguity. When it served them, they could claim their violence was justified by their faith. When the church needed their support, the rules could be bent or ignored. If caught between loyalty to a lord and obedience to the church, most knights chose the path that brought the most reward, or the least risk. The church's efforts to shape knightly ideals were always running up against the realities of power, ambition, and survival. For the church, this was a constant balancing act. They needed knights to keep order and defend church lands, but they also wanted to limit the chaos and suffering caused by unchecked violence. The peace and truce of God movements, the ceremonies and oaths, the threats of excommunication, all these tools were meant to steer knights toward a higher standard. But the decentralized nature of medieval society and the complex web of loyalties and obligations made it almost impossible for the church to enforce its rules consistently. Even so, the church's attempts to shape knightly ideals left a mark. The language of chivalry borrowed heavily from religious values: piety, charity, mercy. The image of the knight as a protector of the weak and a servant of God became part of the broader myth. Songs, stories, and artwork from the time show knights kneeling in prayer, defending churches, and swearing oaths to uphold justice. The church's influence helped create the ideal of the noble knight, even if the reality was far more complicated. Over time, this ideal took on a life of its own. The stories of knights who lived by the chivalric code, who fought for justice and protected the innocent, became powerful symbols. They offered hope in a world that was often violent and uncertain. People wanted to believe in the possibility of a higher standard, even if they rarely saw it in action. The church's vision of the knight as a moral force became woven into the culture, shaping how later generations remembered the Middle Ages. But the gap between the myth and the messy, everyday reality was always there. The church's efforts to guide knightly behaviour sometimes worked, but just as often they were ignored or twisted to fit the needs of the powerful. Knights could be both protectors and oppressors, saints and sinners, often at the same time. The ideal survived, even when the actions fell short. And yet, there's something about that image of the noble knight that sticks with us. The stories, the rituals, the language of honour and service, they all helped create a legacy that's lasted centuries. Maybe that's why the idea of knight still feels so powerful even now, long after the last real knight hung up his sword. Despite centuries of brutal reality, the romantic knight lives on in our stories. Why? The image of the noble knight shining in armour and fighting for justice is everywhere. Even after learning about the harsh truths of medieval knighthood, you still see knights as heroes in movies, children's books, and even in the names of modern charities. It's like we can't let go of the idea that somewhere out there, someone strong and brave is standing up for what's right. But where does this image actually come from? And why does it stick around even when we know better? To figure that out, you have to look back at where the myth really took root. The stories that shaped our idea of knighthood weren't written by peasants or people who suffered under knights. They came from the pens of poets and chroniclers who wanted to inspire and entertain. Take the Song of Roland, for example. Composed around 1100, it glorified Roland's loyalty and courage, painting him as a model of chivalry while glossing over the suffering of peasants caught up in war. The tales of King Arthur and his knights did the same thing. They gave us a world where knights were pious, generous, and always on the side of justice. These stories didn't describe how things really were. They described how people wished they could be. The chivalric code that you hear about, bravery, courtesy, protecting the weak, was more of a wish list than a rule book. Knights swore oaths and heard sermons about honour, but as you've seen, those ideals were often set aside when money, land or power was at stake. The code was useful for managing the reputation of the knightly class, giving them something noble to point to whenever someone questioned their actions. In reality, the code could be bent, ignored, or used as a shield for behaviours that had nothing to do with protecting the innocent. Why did these stories become so popular? Part of it is that they offered hope. The Middle Ages were violent and uncertain. It's easier to admire a knight on a quest for justice than to face the reality of armed men collecting taxes or burning villages. People wanted heroes they could look up to, and the stories of chivalry filled that need. You can almost picture a young squire listening to tales of Arthur's Round Table, dreaming of doing something great, not realising that the real work of a knight was much less glamorous. Over time, the myth grew and changed with society. By the 19th century, the knightly ideal had gotten a total makeover. Post-Victorian neo-romantics reimagined knightly values to fit their own ideals, just as 19th century British nobles revived chivalry ceremonies for pageants. Chivalry became less about armoured warriors on horseback, and more about what it meant to be a good person. Being a knight was about politeness, self-sacrifice, and treating others with respect. Far removed from the realities of medieval warfare, the past was softened, cleaned up, and turned into something that felt safe and admirable. The Arthurian legends are a great example of how the myth keeps getting recycled. In the late 19th century, these stories were revived and polished, turning King Arthur and his knights into icons of virtue and fair play. The new versions left out the bloodier parts and focused on loyalty, love, and big moral choices. Knights became symbols of what people wish their leaders could be: honest, brave, and always on the side of the little guy. The stories made it easy to forget that the real knights were usually fighting for their own interests or those of the elite. You can see how this ideal keeps getting picked up and repurposed. Modern honours systems like the Order of the British Empire still use the word knighthood, but there's no battlefield or armour involved. Today, being knighted is about service, charity, and public recognition. The sword is mostly ceremonial, and the values attached to knighthood are about helping others, not enforcing a lord's will. The myth has become a way to reward good deeds and inspire people to act with integrity, even if it has nothing to do with the original meaning of the word. It's not just official honours either. The word chivalry gets thrown around in all kinds of ways today. People talk about chivalry when they mean politeness, especially in how men treat women. That's a far cry from the medieval code, which mostly governed how knights treated other nobles and said little about the rights of commoners or women outside the aristocracy. But the myth has been stretched and reshaped so much that it now stands for a general sense of decency, even if the original code was far more selective. Why does the myth stick around? It's comforting to believe in heroes. When you're faced with a world that feels chaotic or unfair, the idea that someone out there is fighting for what's right can be reassuring. The knightly myth gives us a way to imagine that courage and honour can make a difference, even if we know that the real world is messier. It's easier to hold on to the image of a noble knight than to wrestle with the truth that most knights were just as flawed, ambitious, and self-serving as anyone else. That gap between the myth and reality isn't unique to knights. It's something you see again and again in history. We create stories about what we wish people could be, and those stories often outlast the facts. The myth of the knight is powerful because it speaks to a deep hope that someone will stand up for justice, even if the real knights rarely did. It's a kind of wishful thinking that helps people feel better about the past, and maybe about the present too. But there's value in looking at the reality behind the myth. When you learn that knights were just as complicated as anyone else, it doesn't have to ruin the stories. Instead, it adds another layer. You start to see how systems of power shape the way people behave, and how ideals can be used to justify actions that don't always match up. Knights were celebrated for their honour, but often acted as enforcers for the powerful. Their stories remind us that the distance between what we say we value and what we actually do can be pretty wide. Even now, the legacy of the knightly myth shapes how we think about leadership, heroism, and what it means to do the right thing. The image of the knight is still used to promote charity, service, and moral virtue, even if the swords and armour are long gone. The stories we tell about knights say as much about what we want from our leaders and from ourselves as they do about medieval history. Understanding the legacy of the knightly myth isn't just about history. It's about seeing how the stories we tell shape our expectations, our values, and sometimes even our actions. The knight, as a symbol, keeps changing to fit what people need. That's why the gap between the myth and the reality matters. It's a reminder that the ideals we admire are often more complicated than we'd like to believe. So, when you think about knights, whether you picture shining armour or something more realistic, remember that the stories we tell about them reveal as much about us as they do about the past. The way we hold on to the myth, even after learning the truth, is a clue to the kinds of heroes we hope for and the kind of world we wish we lived in. That's the real legacy of the knightly myth. It's not just about castles and quests. It's about the distance between what we hope for and what actually happens. And that's a theme that goes way beyond the Middle Ages. When you look at what the story of knights actually reveals, it's less about swords and shining armour, and more about how we build our own myths, and why we hold on to them. The gap between what knights were supposed to be and what they actually did isn't just a medieval curiosity. It's a pattern that shows up again and again in every culture, every era. The knightly myth, with its polished surface and hidden cracks, gives us a way to see ourselves, our hopes, our blind spots, and the way we use stories to make sense of a complicated world. Think about how medieval writers handled the gap between reality and ideal. Just as French crusade hymns sanctified violence in the name of faith, Chivalric romances turn the rough edges of knightly life into tales of virtue and honour. The brutality and self-interest that shaped everyday medieval life were cleaned up, repackaged, and given a noble gloss. When the Knights Templar sacked Constantinople in 1204, chroniclers focused on their piety and religious mission, not the destruction and looting that went hand in hand with their campaigns. The result was a legend that could inspire, but also conveniently forget the messier details. It's not just about telling a good story, it's about serving a purpose. The chivalric code wasn't simply a list of ideals, it was a tool for managing power. Rulers and church leaders used it to channel the aggression of the knightly class toward goals that suited their interests. Defending the realm, fighting in the Crusades, or keeping order at home. Loyalty, honour and religious piety weren't just virtues, they were ways to keep a potentially dangerous group in check. This same pattern shows up in other times and places, whenever a dominant group uses myth and ideology to legitimize power and maintain social order. As time went on, the myth only grew stronger. When French noblemen founded the Order of the Garter in 1348, chivalry became a symbol of elite power and exclusivity, not a battlefield reality. The code was more about status and ceremony than about protecting the weak or living up to impossible standards. The stories and rituals that surrounded knighthood created a sense of belonging for those at the top, while leaving everyone else on the outside. The myth became a way to reinforce who mattered and who didn't. You see the same thing happening today, just in different forms. The word chivalry has drifted far from its origins. Most people now connect it with politeness, respect, maybe holding a door open or standing up for someone in trouble. The original code, which was selective and often cruel, has been replaced with something much softer and more appealing. It's a perfect example of how myths evolve. The rough parts are sanded down, and the story changes to fit what people want to believe about themselves and their values. But why do we keep doing this? Why are we so drawn to these idealized versions of the past? Part of it is comfort. The world is complicated, and it feels good to believe in heroes, even if those heroes never quite lived up to the hype. It's easier to hold on to a story where knights stand for justice and courage than to face the reality of mercenaries collecting taxes, burning villages, or switching sides for a better deal. These myths give us something to aspire to, even if the facts tell a different story. There's also a deeper reason. Myths aren't just about the past, they're about the present. They help us make sense of who we are and where we come from. They shape our sense of identity, belonging, and purpose. When you hear stories about noble knights, you're not just learning about history, you're absorbing values that still matter today. The same thing happens with national histories, founding legends, and stories about great leaders. The details get smoothed out, the contradictions are set aside, and what's left is something that feels inspiring, even if it isn't strictly true. But there's a cost to all this myth-making. When we focus on the legend, we lose sight of the real people and the real struggles that shaped history. The story of knights is a perfect example. The chivalric code sounded noble, but it mostly protected the interests of the elite. The peasants who worked the land, the women who had little protection, the townsfolk who paid the price for someone else's honour. They all lived outside the myth, and their stories rarely made it into the official record. The myth of the knight doesn't just leave out the messy parts, it leaves out entire groups of people. This is why looking at the gap between myth and reality matters. By questioning the stories we've been told, we get a fuller, more honest picture of the past. We start to see how power works, how ideals can be used to control or inspire, and how easily history can be rewritten to fit someone's agenda. The knightly myth isn't just about shining armour and noble deeds, it's about who gets to decide what matters, whose voices are heard, and whose are forgotten. It's not all negative, though. There's something hopeful in the way people keep reaching for ideals, even when they fall short. The fact that the myth of the knight survived for so long says something about what people wanted from their leaders and from themselves. It shows a longing for justice, courage, and honour, even if those things were rarely delivered in full. The contradiction between the ideal and the reality is what makes the story of knights so interesting and so human. So what can the story of knights teach us about ourselves? First, it reminds us to be careful about the stories we accept. Just because something is repeated often or wrapped in tradition and ceremony doesn't mean it's the whole truth. The knightly myth is a lesson in the dangers of uncritical nostalgia. When we cling to the polished version of the past, we risk missing out on the real lessons about power, inequality, and the ways people justify their actions. Second, it shows that ideals are powerful, but they're not enough on their own. The chivalric code may have inspired some knights to acts of bravery or mercy, but it also gave cover to violence and exploitation. Ideals can guide us, but they can also be used to excuse behaviour that falls far short of what we claim to value. The gap between what we say and what we do is always there, and it's worth paying attention to. Third, the story of the knights helps us see the value of questioning myths, not just accepting them. When you look closely at the contradictions, at the way knights could be both protectors and oppressors, heroes and villains, you get a clearer sense of how history really works. No group, no institution, no era is as simple as the stories suggest. That's not a reason to give up on ideals, but it is a reason to be honest about where they come from and how they're used. Finally, the story of knights makes it clear that history is more than a collection of names and dates. It's a living process, shaped by the stories we tell and the values we choose to uphold. The myth of the knight is still with us, not because it's true in every detail, but because it speaks to something people want to believe. If you can see the difference between the legend and the reality, you're already closer to understanding not just the past, but the present. Knights weren't perfect, and neither are the stories we tell about them. But if you look at the contradictions, the missed opportunities, and the moments when ideals clashed with reality, you start to see something familiar. The story of the knights isn't just about a distant era, it's a mirror. It reflects our own struggles to balance what we hope for with what we actually do. And if you can keep that in mind, it becomes easier to look beyond the surface of any myth and ask what's really hiding underneath. As you think about the knights and the stories that have grown up around them, remember that every legend, no matter how shiny, has another side. The real lesson isn't about armour or castles, it's about learning to look past the surface, to question what you're told, and to find the truth in the details. That's what the knights can teach us if we're willing to listen. And maybe, after seeing how myths can blur the lines between fantasy and reality, you'll find yourself wondering what other stories deserve a closer look. Knights weren't the spotless heroes we imagine, but their story shows how easily legends take hold. As Livia Gershon notes, chivalry was created for grittier reasons, to channel knightly violence into church-sanctioned wars and protect elite interests. The popular image of the knight as a defender of the weak often hides the reality of power, control, and sometimes brutal enforcement. So here's your challenge. Challenge the legends you grew up with. dig into primary accounts and medieval chronicles to see the real stakes behind those shining helmets. Seeing knights as fallible people reminds us to look beyond surface myths when exploring any era,